And, like I was asking Bernice, I was just asking how it went. I hope you guys had or I wished you guys had the test back so that at least we can then just talk about how it went. But I'm pretty much sure that you did the feedback, and feedback is very much important because, like I said, even though the technicality is not the same, but now you have to then be, looking at the exam technique, and the exam technique applies not only to the first test that you are writing, but it applies, throughout. And it's very much important that even when you get the scripts back, you then sit down and then you do, a proper feedback on your exam technique. And we're going to touch on this tomorrow again when we then do the question in terms of exam technique, in terms of how you need to then go through the paper, how you need to read it, how you need to understand the required, how you need to plan the required as well, right? Because that's very much important. Because sometimes, yes, you might know the technicality, but if you don't have the right strategy on how to answer questions, then it becomes a problem. So we're going to touch on that tomorrow when we go through the question. And what we're going to do today, we're going to go back to just the basic principles, because when it comes to costing, and people also ask me a lot to say, how do I pass costing? It looks complicated. But if you then just look at it, it's just going back to the principles, and then just understanding the principles of costing. And also, when you know the technicality, you need to understand why. So with costing, you can't get out of it if you then don't know the technicality, and if you don't know the why behind why we are doing certain things, right? So if you're doing with accounting, or if you're dealing with accounting, and I know my accounting colleagues are going to be very much angry with me, you can get away with sort of like cramming, right? Sometimes, I have my journals, I then go and then just try to cram my journals, because it's whole based, right? So you have guidelines that will tell you to say debit this, credit this, and you can then just cram that, even though you don't understand the why behind it, and then you find your way around the test. But with costing, it becomes very much difficult, or with financial management accounting, it becomes very much difficult, because I might know that there's a high-low method, or I can cram a high-low method. But if I don't know the reason behind why I'm doing the high-low method, it becomes an issue, because firstly, when they bring those principles in the exam, I might fail to even pick up that I have to do a high-low method. And I might not even know why I need to do a high-low method, because it forms part of a calculation to get to a certain point. So if I don't understand why I have to do a high-low method, for example, or a linear programming, or calculating the absorption rate, then I won't really know or have a final picture to say this is where I want to go and this is what I want to do. Hence, it's very much important that we then understand the basic principles to say, why are we doing this? If we're talking about standard costing, and we have to then understand why we have a sales mix, and why we are calculating as well the usage variance, we then need to also understand why we are doing it, so that come the exam day, we have a clear picture to say that this is the final solution that we want to get to. And then maybe these calculations are going to then assist us or help us into getting to the final solution. So it's very much important. So today we're going to do that. We have a couple of topics to get through, but some of them, what we're going to do is that when we do the question tomorrow, we're then going to be touching on some of the principles thereof, on top of the exam technique, some of the principles of the topics that maybe we won't be able to then finish today, right? So I'm going to switch off my camera now, and then I'm going to share my screen, so you guys can just confirm when you see my screen. So I'm gonna share this confirmation.
Yeah, we can see screen.
All right, cool. So what we're going to then do, which is then the starting point of costing, because you then need to understand why we actually, cost a product. And, because all these topics are connected one way or another. So you firstly have to then understand why do we then have to cost a product, and what involves that, and what is the reasoning behind it, and which costs do we then have to take into account, right? And it looks simple, but then a lot of people then miss some of these principles that are here. So I'm just gonna go back to, just an introduction to costing, so that we can then just understand some of the cost, and then we then link them to, topics like your standard costing, and then also link them to topics like your variable and absorption costing as well, because this is where it all begins, right? So if I'm then costing a product, so say I'm selling, yeah, if there's someone who uh, unmuted their mic, if we can just all mute. Thanks. So yeah, so if we then go back to then the basic principles, so you are costing a product, right? So say you then have a car that you are then costing. So you know that in terms of my production, I have then this car, I have to put tires, I have to then put, your seats, your seat belt, I have to then put the engine, and then there are people as well that have to then work there as well. So I have then my labor cost, which is then going to then be direct, and then I have some costs that are not really direct as well, and I have all these overheads, right? And I have admin costs as well. So the first thing will then be to separate all those costs and then know why we then have different costs. So if I'm then costing this car, so the first thing that I know is that I will have direct cost, and this direct cost will then be the costs that are linked to the car directly. So if I'm talking about direct materials, I know that if I'm talking about a tire, if I put this one unit, which is a car, I then know that okay, I have materials which are the tires, and then I can directly see them on my product. So those then become your direct material that you then need to then include. Then you have your direct labor. So direct labor as well, because people are working directly into the production of this car. So it means that you can then trace the hours that they are then working, right? And then you say that these are your direct labors, hours that are needed to then make, say, one unit of a car, right? So you then have all these this direct cost, which are your prime cost as well. Then you have other manufacturing overhead, and this is where it becomes tricky, right? So this manufacturing overhead, because also they are necessary for the production of this car, right? So they're necessary for the production of this car, and I also need to cost them here when I'm costing my product. But then the problem now is that these manufacturing overheads are not direct, in a way that if I have one unit of a car, I can't then determine to say that, okay, the factory rent, for example, in this car, the amount that I paid for the factory rent, I can trace it directly to the car. So this manufacturing overhead means that we now need to then allocate them to then the products that we are then manufacturing. And then the tricky part is that now these manufacturing overheads can then be fixed or variable, right? So let me then just put it here. So they can then be fixed overheads, and then they can also be variable overheads, meaning that at some point, I then need to determine the split between the manufacturing overheads, right? Between the fixed overhead and variable overheads. So sometimes in a question, they will then say the fixed of manufacturing overheads are, and then you need to then cost this product. But if you don't realize that manufacturing overheads include both the fixed overheads and the variable overheads, you might end up just including only then the fixed overheads and not include the variable overheads, or vice versa. You can then just include only the variable overheads and not include the fixed overheads, because they can confuse you, and then you just say overheads and then you think that's everything that I then need there. But you have then two types of these manufacturing overheads, which will then be the fixed or variable. However, sometimes they'll give you one amount, and then they will say the total manufacturing overheads are this amount. So you should then know that this total manufacturing overheads will then include both the fixed and variable. So it means that sometimes if I have to do my break even, or if I have to do my variable system, then I then need to separate these two costs, because now they gave me as one. So this concept also is very much important. And then I see candidates every time uh, being unable to then either determine that these manufacturing overheads have then these two parts to it. And then now, after doing that, this then becomes your total cost, right? So this then becomes the total cost of the product, and then you have it. So the other thing that when it comes to costing, you need to be mindful of, and we're going to touch it even when we do certain examples here, is the measurement. So you need to then know your measurement to say, okay, if I'm dealing with, am I dealing with units? Am I dealing with a batch? Am I dealing with, measures like liters? So you then need to understand that. And if it confuses you, you then need to just sit down and then make sure that you then have a right strategy on how you address that. Because when we are costing, we'll have then different measurements, because maybe you need a kg of this, maybe you need a liter of this. And then that's where people get confused as well, right? So the principle you know, but it's just a matter of how then do I understand the measurements that are then coming into this product. So that becomes very important as a basic for costing, such that you then understand it to say, if I'm dealing with material, if I'm dealing with labor, this is the hours. If I'm dealing with materials, maybe this then the kg. Maybe you need 2 kg to make 1 unit, meaning that in 1 unit that I need, I must have 2 kg of materials, right? So then in 2 units, I will then need to have 4 kg. So the measurement as well should be something that when you then do your feedback, you should then go back to it to say, am I really understanding how I then need to address, this measurement concern? Then you have then the total cost of the product. After that, you then have other administration expenses. So these administration expenses, they don't form part of your cost of a product, but what they do, they are necessary for us running the business, right? So I mean, we can't then produce a car if we don't incur these expenses, because we then need to have them for the overall business. And if we then have this business, we are then able to be able to then manufacture a car, or then produce a car. So this manufacturing or administration expense or administration overhead, again, right? You then need to determine them or to separate them from manufacturing overhead, because manufacturing overhead are necessary for us to cost the product. However, administration overheads or the administration expenses then are necessary for the business as a whole, but then they don't talk to the product that we are then costing. So it's very much important. And then we call this period costing, right? Or period costs. And then you then have to then expense this administration expenses. And then this will then be, maybe you're paying for your administration building, or you're paying the admin staff, or your advertisement costing, or advertise cost, I mean. So you have to advertise this product, but then it does not really, we can't really trace it to the product, so we don't include them in terms of our production expenses. So this then becomes an overhead again, which is then just or it comes an administration cost, which does not form part of our total cost of a product. So it's very much important as well to distinguish between these two, right? Because now you then get confused when it comes to that. Then this then becomes all the costs that I then need to deal with. Then if we're then talking about separation, so this is where we then talk about your high-low method, right? So why would I then need high-low method, or why would I need to use the high-low method? And the reason for me to then use the high-low method is because I need to separate my manufacturing overhead. So I need to separate them between fixed cost and between variable cost, right? And then this again is a technique that I can then use to then separate these overheads. But then the question will then be, why am I separating these overheads between the fixed cost and the variable cost? And then this then takes us to variable costing, right? And then I'm gonna go and then I'm gonna do questions, but I just wanted to give you, this basic so that you can then understand at a basic level. So this takes us to then these two systems, which is then the variable costing and the absorption costing as well, right? So we have variable costing and then we then have absorption costing. And what is then the difference between the two? So the variable costing, it takes into account variable manufacturing costs only, right? So it means that my direct material is variable, meaning I'm gonna then include it here. My direct labor is variable, I'm gonna include it here. However, my manufacturing overhead, which includes fixed overheads and variable overheads, will then now need to be separated because I then need to determine a portion of the fixed overheads and then also determine the portion of a variable overhead, because the variable overhead, I'm going to need it when I determine my system, which is then the variable costing, which only takes into account then the variable costs. So it means that if I'm then given, which obviously they will give you both of them included because they want to see if you then understand that these manufacturing overheads have a portion of fixed and have a portion of variable, and you then need to separate it if you are then doing your variable costing system. So it means that once I separated or I separate the two, I then need to then include my overhead here, which is variable, so that I can then get what I can then get or calculate my contribution, right? So I take my sales and then I minus all these costs that are here. I minus all these costs that are here so that I can get my contribution, right? So if I get my contribution, it means that if I'm then calculating then the bottom line, I will then need to include here my overheads, which are then fixed overheads, and then I also then include then the administration expenses as well here, right? So let me just do this. So yeah, so I have to then include both of this. Yeah. So I have to include then both of this here, because when I then do my contribution and I'm using my variable costing system, I only include variable overheads. And then I get my contribution, then I have the fixed overheads coming here as a period cost, and then being expensed together with the administration expense to then come and get my total here. But then the tricky part of the variable costing, and that's just the only tricky part. Sorry? All right. And if you have any questions, you guys can stop me at given time. I can't see hands, so you can then just jump in. So the tricky part here will then be to then separate my variable overheads between the fixed portion and the variable portion so that I can get my contribution. And then this also is very much important when we then do the sales variances when we are dealing with standard costing, and we're going to come back here because when we are dealing with standard costing and we have to touch our sales price and the variances, we need to determine which system are we then using. So it's very much important to say that you understand the system that the company is using and understand what are the implications of that system. So if we're then using the variable costing system, it means that we calculate what we call contribution. And then contribution includes our variable overheads, meaning I need to get my direct, my labor. But again, if I have my manufacturing overheads, I need to split them. So sometimes they will tell you that variable manufacturing overheads. So okay, so you know already that okay, they gave me my variable manufacturing overheads. But sometimes they'll just say manufacturing overheads, and then you need to then it needs to trigger you to say, oh, hold on, manufacturing overheads. I can have both of these. Then I then need to then separate them to then get my contribution, right? And then we'll touch a bit on the separation method. Then the fixed overheads becomes a period cost, and then you then get the total amount. So that will then be your variable costing system. And obviously you can see that this is not really in line with your accounting, right? So this is just for internal reporting, so that we can then determine the contribution that is being made by a product, and then we can then better understand to say that this product is making more contribution than this product, and then we can have better decisions, because remember, fixed costs are already there, so we're going to pay them regardless. But if we then focus on variable, we can then see to say that if we then make more of this product, we can then have more contribution, and then we can then make those decisions, right? And then again, it will help us in terms of controlling our costs, and then just make sure that we don't then incur cost overruns, and then we are set in terms of determining the contribution of the product. Then you have absorption. So now absorption is in line with what you do when you then do your IFRS, right? So with your IFRS, it will then say, obviously these fixed overheads, you have to then cost them into the product or the inventory, and then you then need to then include them here, and then you get your gross profit instead of your contribution. So in terms of absorption, you'll then get your gross profit, which is then in line with what we do when we deal with we deal with accounting, right? So, but accounting then says, and that's why IS2 mostly it won't really get tested a lot when you then deal with accounting, right? But it depends. It will then come a lot when you're then dealing with costing, because you're costing then that product. And if you're using absorption costing, you're sort of like doing what you're supposed to do when you do accounting, right? So with costing, I still have my direct on my sales, then direct material, I have my direct labor. But now in terms of my overhead, I then need to cost all of them into what? I then need to cost them into then this product. And if you then go to IS2, I think it's around paragraph 12 or paragraph 13, it will then tell you to say, when you then do this, you will then use normal capacity or budgeted capacity, and then you'll also then use budgeted overheads, right? So I'm gonna have my direct material, which obviously I'm buying my direct material for this product. I'm going to have my direct labor for this product. But then in terms of my manufacturing overheads, instead of me, because remember, we want to make decisions here. So instead of me waiting until the end of the financial year to determine my actual manufacturing overheads, I can then estimate them. So if I then estimate them, I will then have those budgeted overheads, and then I will then get my absorption rate, and then my absorption rate as well will then be with the budgeted units. So I'm not going to then use my actual units, right? And I see again a lot of candidates when it comes to absorption costing using actual units in terms of determining the absorption rate. And you don't use actual unit, right? So because firstly, with actual unit, you can then have patterns that are, so say you're in the production process, and then you then have things that are happening in the production that lead to an increase in fixed costs or in budget in those costs, right? In manufacturing overheads. And then because now the manufacturing overhead is increasing, it will then give a picture as if this product of yours is very much expensive, whereas the product itself is not really expensive, right? So maybe you had unexpected repairs on your machines, and then now you incur all these additional costs. So if I then go and say, I'm going to use my actual, so my actual, it has all these unexpected repairs that I was then doing, unexpected maintenance that I was then doing. So this will then fluctuate, or it will then increase my actual. So it means that if I'm absorbing my actual, I then have a picture where I have this overhead cost, which is very much more than what I would normally have on a normal production, right? Hence, we then absorb using the budgeted overhead rather than then the actual. fixed overhead. So that's then one thing. So even in accounting, you will then see that if you then go to IS2, it will tell you that use then the normal capacity instead of then the actual capacity, because sometimes the actual capacity might then have all these fluctuations that might happen as a result of maybe something happened that does not normally happen in the production. So maybe there was load shedding and all of our machines, died, and then we have to get more. So now you have this actual overhead cost, which is actually high. And if I'm now costing this product, if I'm gonna then use this, if I'm gonna use now this actual cost, it means that now I'm gonna do what? Overstate my product. Hence, you then go back and use the budgeted units there. So this is very much important because I see candidates also when they deal with absorption system, they using actual that has happened. So when you absorb and you get your rate, you then have to then use and get your rate. Then when you have that absorption rate, you can then multiply it by then the actual unit to get the manufacturing overheads. But then here, you then come and then get your gross margin, same as the accounting. Then you only have what you call administration expense that you then go into then incur here to get to then the final amount. So this is then the difference between the two systems, right? So the other one, we're getting the contribution because we are then dealing with then the variable cost. And then the other one, we then get the gross margin because now we are then dealing with also the fixed cost included, but we have to then determine the absorption rate for us to then get that absorption. Happiness. All right. Then we have the two systems here, which is the variable and then the absorption cost. And we started here to say a product, when you cost it, you need to have all this, right? And then you then need to separate. So if we're separating, there are different methods, right? And then some of them I will then touch them tomorrow. So we have the high low. So the high low, what it then does, so if there's someone that just unmuted their mics, if you can just all mute. Thanks. So what the high low does, I said is separate these two, and separating these two obviously for this or this, or if we then have to calculate our break even and we have to determine all our total fixed cost, right? So remember, break even will be your fixed cost, these two included, over your contribution, right, per unit. Then you then get your break even, but you still need to then separate these two as well. So you then use the high low. So the high low, what it will then do, it will change the change in your cost. So your highest activity and the lowest activity, and also the activity of the units as well, and then it will then change, and then you get the contribution per unit. But I don't want to touch more on it. I will touch more on it tomorrow. The break even. So that's then the high low. I mean, so that's one system that you can then use in terms of then just separation of your fixed cost overheads and your variable overheads. You can then use the break even. But if I'm doing that, I need to know, am I doing the variable costing system where I then have this, or am I calculating my break even where I need my total fixed cost, right? So I then have to have a final plan to say this is then my final plan. Happiness. Then we have again one method that you can then use, and I don't want to touch more on it, right? But it is then the regression method as well. So if you guys have seen that formula, which says 1 plus a bx, right? So this then becomes the regression method. And this least square regression method, what it does, because with variable, with high low, because we're saying high low method, is going to then take the change in price or the change in cost over the change in units or the change in activity, the change in activity. So it's going to take the highest point and the lowest point. And then the change in activity is going to it's also going to be the highest point and the lowest point. So what this list regression does, because in practice, you find that you have, a lot of, your cost activities, a lot of points, right? So other than just taking the highest and the lowest, it takes everything into account. And then it then goes and plots a line to say that, okay, this is then a line or a regression, which will then then be this formula here as well. But I don't want to touch a lot on this one as well. I will deal with both of these methods tomorrow. So I just wanted to introduce them. So the list regression is going to take everything into account, all the points
Sorry,
into
sir.
account. Yes.
Hello.
Come
I
through.
think I'm lost. Good
Okay.
day. Sorry for not greeting.
Okay.
I I think you lost me from you said in a company we do the direct cost, the costs. Okay, let me just deal with the cost. And
Okay.
then I do understand they add to the total cost product.
Yes. Yeah.
But I don't understand what is the link between the high-low method that you just that you are teaching us now to the
Mm.
cost that you explained previously.
All right. Okay, yeah, and thanks, because that's very much important, right? So the cost remains. So we have the cost here, right, to cost a product. So here we are together. So maybe stay on the line, and let's just engage. So here we are together, right?
Okay.
So we are
Yes.
together here in terms of the cost, right?
Yes.
So in
Yes.
terms of this cost, because we said that we're going to take all then the production cost, being your direct material, your direct labor, and your manufacturing overheads, right?
Okay.
However, these manufacturing overheads, they're split into two, which is then the fixed cost and the fixed overheads and the variable overheads,
Okay.
right?
Yes.
So, and then it gives us our total cost of the product. So we are agreeing to say, okay, these are the total
Yes.
cost. Then manufacturing overhead includes this too, right? So
Okay.
so so so
Yes.
so, so then sometimes they're gonna give us. So when you cost the product, this is what you wanna do. But then now we then need to also determine and moving from the total cost of a product, now we are coming to the systems that a company can use, right, to make decision. So you can
Yes.
then use a variable costing system and an absorption costing system, right?
Okay.
And then
Yes.
a variable costing system will take into account your variable costs only, which will then be your direct material. And then you have to then calculate the contribution and then your direct labor. And then you will then also take, you'll also then take your, so direct labor. So you'll also then take your variable, because it's taking variable only, variable overheads to then come to
Yes.
the contribution. We agree, right?
Yes. Yes.
But now if I'm taking my variable overheads here to come to the contribution, sometimes the question will then
Yes.
come, and then the question will then give me manufacturing overheads as a total. So for example, it will then say your manufacturing overheads is 10,000, for example.
Yes.
But now I know that if I'm then dealing with the variable costing system, I need to split my manufacturing overheads between fixed overheads and variable overheads. Why? Because if I'm dealing with the variable costing system where I have to calculate my contribution, I only have to then separate them and take variable overheads into account, and then fixed overheads will then stay here as a period cost.
Oh, okay. Can I ask something? Is
Go
it
for it.
because if let's say i- will it depend whether the company is using the absorption
Absorption, yeah,
system
or
or
the
okay.
variable costing, yes.
Okay.
So in
Okay.
terms of these two systems, it will, right? Because
Yes.
now if I'm using the variable costing, I need to get my contribution. So I then need to separate my variable and my fixed. But if I'm then using an absorption, I then need
Mm-hmm.
to get an absorption rate. So my absorption rate will then include both the fixed and then the variable as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And then also it also assists if you are doing things like your break even. Remember, break even also is going to take into account fixed costs over contribution, right? So if you're doing your
Yes.
CVP, and then if you're doing contribution, you then need to get total fixed costs. So you need to also separate these manufacturing overheads. So your high load then
Mm.
becomes technique that you can then use to then separate the portion of the fixed overhead and the portion of the variable overhead.
Oh, okay. Now I do understand. Thank you very much, sir.
All right, no problem. So you then use it. All right. So but this then becomes then the basic, right? Then we have absorption costing, which also we're gonna do tomorrow when we do the question. because I want to go to standard costing, because I know you guys, when it comes to standard costing, it's a problem. You get confused a lot. So then the absorption, the ABC method. So now the ABC method will then be, so when I do the ABC, and this is very much important. So the question will then come, and it might then come and say, calculate the total cost of, so calculate the total cost of a product A, right? Calculate the total cost of product A, for example, using ABC. Using the ABC. So there's the traditional method and the ABC. So let's say we are then using ABC method. So I'm calculating the total cost using ABC method. So what I see a lot of people doing here is that they go and calculate or allocate using ABC and then they stop there, right? Which you didn't answer the required, because the required is saying that calculate the total cost of a product using the ABC method. And what is the total cost of a product? The total cost of a product is that I'm going to first then determine the direct cost, which is then the direct labor, right? That is straightforward because it's variable. I'm going to then also determine the direct material, right? Then that also is then straightforward. However, now in terms of the overheads, because the overheads are not then direct in a way, right? I then need to use ABC, right? So say this is then product A, then but we have B, and then we have C as well. So the direct overheads or direct labor will then be different, right? So different from all of them, because we need different hours to do A, to do B, and to do C, and we need different materials to do A, to do B, to do C. However, we then have a manufacturing overheads that applies to all of them, right? So these manufacturing overheads are the ones that we're then going to use ABC to then determine then the cost applicable to each of them, right? So that's when we then use ABC to then do what? To then allocate these manufacturing overheads here. But the direct material and direct labor will still remain for each and every one of the products, right? Because we know the hours that will go to A, we know the hours that will go to B, we know the hours that will go to C. Even as materials, we know the hours that will go to A, we know the hours that will go to B, we know the hours that the material that will go to C. But then now, if I'm then going to then deal with this overhead, so instead of just using one unit that I use, I then need to then think about activities, right? And we're going to touch on this because tomorrow example that we're going to do has ABC as well. So I'm now going to then touch on activities, and maybe let me just come here so that you can then see the different steps. So I then need to then touch on the activities, right? So it means that if I'm then dealing with that manufacturing overhead, I then need to then determine to say, okay, what are then my activities that I then need here? And then after determining my activities, I then need to determine the cost associated with each and every activity. And then from there, I need to determine my cost drivers. And then I need to then determine my cost rate, right? And then we're going to touch on this and why we use ABC. So if I then just go through this example, and then you then see the difference between your ABC, why we need to use ABC, and why we need to use the traditional methods, right? Then after doing that, we can then go to standard costing, because that's where my focus is today. So if I then just go through this, right? So there's two methods that you can use. You can use the ABC, or you can use the traditional method. The traditional method is where you then have the units, and then you just use, say, machine hours only, instead of then using activities. And the difference becomes here, and then you're going to see the difference when we then just go through this example. So I'm going to go through this example. So you recently moved to Gauteng as a newly qualified CA and work in a very demanding environment. You then rented an apartment with a friend of yours who works a casual and less demanding job. You decided that all the cost for the month relating to the apartment that you are renting will be split in a fair manner, right? So you're saying all the costs that we then going to have, we're going to split them in a fair manner. Then this becomes then the cost. The monthly bills for the first month were as follows. So you then have 7.8. And this 7.8 is split into rent, electricity, and DSTV, and then it becomes then the 7.8. So this is the cost that you and your friends are going to then split them in a fair manner, right? Then furthermore, further information about the arrangement, right? The apartment that you are renting is 100 square meters in size. Then the common area, which includes the kitchen, lounge, and bathroom, covers 20 square meters. The bedroom occupies the rest of the space. So the bedroom will then be 80, right? Which that 30 square meter is your room, and then your friend's room is 50 square meter. So we are paying rent. You have a bigger room because you have 50 square meter. I have 30 square meter, right? From the 80, and then the 20 is then divided into the kitchens, the lounge, and the bathroom areas. Then, given that you have a demanding job, you hardly spend time at the apartment and you are mostly at the office. You spend roughly 3 hours per day at the apartment, while your friend spends about 12 hours per day, as their job allows for flexible work from home arrangement. So on top of your room being smaller than your friend, you only spend 3 hours at home, and they spend 12 hours at home, right? Meaning, if we're talking about electricity, you are at home for 12 hours, so you're consuming more of the electricity bill because I'm just there for 3 hours and maybe I'm just coming to then sleep. Then even when you are at the apartment, you spend time on your laptop, binge watching Netflix series. If you are watching TV, it's definitely Mzansi Magic or Catching on the Wife and How to Get Away with Murder. And then while your friend is an avid fan of sports. So if you were staying alone, you would have subscribed for DSTV compact subscription, since it grants you access to Mzansi Magic, and you pay a low subscription, which is then 400 per month. The sports channel requires the more expensive DSTV subscription. So it's then saying if you were staying alone, you're just gonna pay 400 because DSTV you want to watch this, but now you're paying 1,000 because your friend wants to watch sports and all those things, right? So your friend has suggested that your monthly bills be split between the two of you equally. And then now the question is, do you agree with the suggestion of your friend to say, okay, even after all this that we have just read, we just went through here, right? So even after the room, you have more space. I'm always not at home, and then now even the channels of DSTV, I don't really watch a lot. So he's then saying, let's split the 7,800 into two. So then the question will then be, do you then agree with your friend to say, let's split this into two? So we are staying together, then let's just split the 7.8 into two. The question will then be, do you agree with this? Anyone wants to go for it? Anyone? What are your thoughts?
I don't think we just split the 7.8 in like half. It should be split according to what we're using. Like for instance, the bedroom size. I've got the smaller bedroom, so I should take a portion that is equivalent to my portion of the bedroom and my electricity bill, me not spending more time at home, the things that I do that would constitute me spending less electricity. So it should be fair according to what I use.
But they're a friend. I'm not gonna say because we are friends, let's split it into half.
You're my friend, but this bill is different.
Okay. Yeah, and you're 100% correct, right? And that is what ABC tries to achieve. So ABC will then say, this cost that I hear between the products, we can't just use one measure to then separate this cost, and then you get your allocation and I get my allocation as well, because it's not fair. What we then need to do, we need to first determine our total cost that we then need to allocate, which is then 7.8. After determining our total cost of 7.8, we need to then go deeper into that 7.8 and then see what makes that 7.8. So that becomes the activities, right? So if you then go back to these steps here, so you then need to determine the cost. And then the first step will then be identifying the major activities. And these activities here will then be, okay, this is the 7.8. All right, but let's see what is costing the 7.8. Let's just not take the 7.8 like that and not see the activities. So the activities will then be the rent, there's electricity, there's the DSTV as well. And that then gives us the total cost. So this becomes our activity. Then after determining the activity, which is then the first step, you then need to estimate the costs associated with each activity. So what does that mean? It means that if I've determined my 7.8, which is the cost, and I've determined that this 7.8, this will then be the activities, I then need to then have a total cost of each and every activity, meaning that from this 7.8, my rental will then be 5,000. My electricity bill will then be 1.8. My subscription will then be 1,000. And then this then becomes the total cost, right? So I have my activities, I have my cost relating to those activities. Then step number 3 will then say identify the factors that influence those costs, right? So that's number 3. So number 1, with the cost, I've determined my activities. Number 2, I've determined the costs associated with each and every activity. Then number 3 will then be, I have this activity which is rental. This is the total amount, all right? But what is then driving this cost? What will then be my cost driver of this? So then if you then go to then the bedrooms, I will then say, okay, from my rent, the cost driver will then be the bedroom, because now I have 30, you have 50. The 20, I can agree that it's a common area, so everyone will then share it, right? But we can then allocate this rent. Instead of me us saying you pay 2.5, I pay 2.5, then my cost driver then becomes then the 30 and or the 80, which is then the square meter of the home. So this then becomes my cost driver, right? So step 1, I have my total cost. I determine the activity. So I break down to say in this cost, my activity will then be rental, electricity, DSTV, and then I have my total cost. And then if we then have a manufacturing, if we just think of manufacturing production, maybe my activities will then be, if I'm doing 2 products, I need to first do inspection, and maybe the inspection for one product and the other product is not the same, right? Maybe I need to do maintenance as part of my activity. Maybe I then need to do repairs as part of my activity. So I can break down the activity and then determine the amount associated with that activity. Then I determine the cost drive. Same with electricity as an activity. I can then say this is then the total or cost pool of this electricity bill. But then what will then be my driver of this 1.8? Then we can then say, okay, maybe you are spending 12 hours at home, I spend 3 hours. Then we can then use the hours, because the more you're at home, you're consuming more electricity as well, to then allocate this amount as well, instead of just us then splitting into 2. So that is then what ABC will then aim to achieve, right? And then you will then see tomorrow. So we're gonna still go through all of this. So I was just then touching on it, just as a base for tomorrow. But we're gonna go through this question, and then we're gonna go through each and every step to say, okay, step number 1, this is it's happening because of this and this and this. But then this is what then the ABC procedure will then achieve. Will then say, determine your activity, determine the cost associated with each and every activity. So if it's rent, this, then determine what is driving my rent, which will then be the 30 and the 50 that is there to determine your driver there. Then you can then allocate. So we'll touch on this again tomorrow when we then go through the question. But again, what is very much important is that if I'm then going back here, where we were saying calculate the total cost of A, using ABC method, it means the cost that we're going to then allocate will then be the manufacturing overheads, right? So not the direct labor and direct material, because this already you can link them to the product, but it will then be things like machines. So maybe we are using one machine for all of them, all three of these products. So, and then we have one cost there. So we then need to say in this cost, let's determine our activity, and then we then allocate to all of these, but we are then allocating our manufacturing overheads. Then once we then do allocate our overheads, we then come back to what? To the cost of the product, which is here, which again, we come back to what we discussed here, right? So we come back to the cost, just that now ABC becomes another system of allocating the manufacturing overheads. All good. All right. Then I'm going to, yeah, so I'm going to then move, and we're then going to then standard costing, right? So I want us to then touch on standard costing. And with standard costing, what I'm going to focus on here, I'm going to then focus a lot on the material variance as well as the sales variance.
Sorry, Manda.
Sure.
So sorry, sir.
Okay.
Good evening. I just want to find out with the high-low method, what
Okay.
do you do if you have step fixed costs?
Okay. So come again.
So I'm saying, what do you do? How do you use the high-low method? If, let's say, for instance, you have your, I believe that it works within the relevant range, right? So you've got that. Then the next thing, your cost now, there are a step fixed thereafter. How do you solve that? I think there was a question like that. I'm not sure if I'm asking the right thing.
Yeah. So you are. So then the question will then be, how will we use the high-low if we are then calculating then the step fixed cost? So step fixed cost will, right? I got your question right?
Yes, I think you got the question right.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So step fixed cost will then be those costs that will remain constant over a range, and then obviously will then change when activity levels, passes or crosses a certain threshold steps, right? So it's still, for me, it still remains the same. So it means that, because what high-low does, it will then take your highest level, and then it will then take your lowest level as well, right? So then it means that you can then go take your highest level, which will then be your units and your total cost there. And then you then going to then take your lowest level, which again will then be your units and total cost. Then you can then use it to get the high-low method, or to then separate the two that is there. But again, if now we have then the step, we have a problem where now the fixed cost is then changing. So you then need to determine where exactly is then the fixed cost changing, because that will then be your last level that you're then going to take when you then calculate the high-low method. Because if your fixed cost then change, it means that now if you're doing your high-low level, you'll then have that fixed cost being changing. So you'll then determine the point where this has to change, and then you then use that as a high-low method. So I'm not sure if I then answered your question there.
Yes, I think you are making perfect sense. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Sure.
Thanks.
All right. All good. Okay. Any questions relating to this before we then move to standard costing? All right. But most of these things we're going to touch them tomorrow, right? Because the question tomorrow has ABC, and I want you guys to go through it before that. It has ABC, it has costing as well, it has decision making, it has CVP. So we're going to touch mostly on the costing part tomorrow. But it means that tomorrow now is going to be easy, because we're also going to be making reference to this, and then we're then going to then deal with that.
Amanda,
All right. Yes, come through.
can I please request that you drop the question on the chat, because I don't think I'm registered for the full module, so I don't have access to the where you pose questions and all that.
All right. The Enunamo team, please assist. I'm not sure who's recording, but yeah, someone is gonna assist you and then they'll drop the question there. But
Sorry, hi, Amanda.
yeah, yes.
Team, you can just reach out to me directly. Everything is available on your OneDrive, but yes, you can just reach out to me directly if you have any challenges locating this.
Okay, thanks. And how do we get to you? Hi, Norma.
Norma?
Or you can just drop a chat in the chat box.
Okay, no, thanks.
Hi,
Okay.
Amanda.
Yes.
Hi, Paki. So you can just drop chats and I'll follow up on the chats.
Yes,
Okay.
come through.
Amanda, I wanted to ask you something. Can you please explain this budgeted overhead and budgeted units again? That
Okay.
part, I missed it.
All right. Sure. So so let me do this. I think I should have a slide here. All right. So let's do this. So we have two systems, right? So we have the variable and the absorption costing. So when you go through your test, they will tell you which system the company is using. Are we using variable or are we using absorption costing? And then with variable, like I said, we then get the contribution, meaning that we need to take all our variable cost. And that's where we can even do the separation between the overheads, manufacturing overheads between fixed and variable, because we only need the variable part to get to our contribution. So that's fine. Then we have the absorption costing, right? So in terms of the absorption costing, and this then becomes the difference, right? So maybe let's go through the slide. So the variable costing will then include direct cost, so and prime cost. So this will then be your direct material and direct labor. So we touched on this. Both of them are going to include that. Then we have variable manufacturing overheads. And I said these manufacturing overheads include two, they include the variable and they include the fixed. And this is very much important because sometimes they just give you manufacturing overheads and then people then just assume that these are only the variable part. And it's not like that unless they state to say variable manufacturing overheads. So the variable overheads will then be included again to both of them. Why on variable costing? Because we need variable overheads. And then on absorption, we then need all of them, variable and fixed. So we'll then also include them as part of the product cost. Then in terms of, so now we did our split. We used high-low or we used the least square regression to then determine the separation between variable and the fixed. And why are we doing this separation? Because when we're dealing with variable costing, we use variable only, right? And then the fixed will be treated as a period cost or as an expense. However, when we do absorption, we'll then need this because what will include it as part of absorption. And when we include it as part of the absorption, instead of us using the actual, we're then going to then have an absorption rate, and then we're then going to then use the budgeted. And I'm going to touch on that because that was your question. But I just wanted to see where it fits. It fits here, right? So, but these ones, we're going to include them as part of the product cost, like I explained. Then we're going to do that allocation absorption rate, which I'm going to touch in a few. So when you do that budgeted absorption rate, it means that because now I'm using the budgeted absorption rate and I'm going to multiply that with my units, I'm now going to have a difference between the allocation that I did and the actual. So that's why you have an under and over recovery. And that also goes as an expense. So I'm going to also touch on the under and over recovery treatment. Then you have the non-manufacturing cost or the admin cost, which are not included as product cost. So we touched on this as well. So they are then, and both of them, either they're variable or fixed, because they're non-manufacturing cost. Even though they're variable, I can't include them as part of my product cost, because there I need costs that I will then see or directly or indirectly linked to my product. Then I get that, right? So these, both of them, the treatment will then be the same. But then the treatment here becomes different when we then deal with the fixed overhead cost. So then the allocation of the fixed overhead cost. So now I'm then going to say, I need to absorb my fixed overhead cost. And I get what I call an overhead allocation rate, right? And then I said this allocation rate is determined by then dividing the budgeted overhead costs by the budgeted level, right? And even in accounting, this is what we do, because in accounting, if you go to IS2, it will tell you that use normal capacity, and normal capacity is what we have budgeted, right? Because normal is not actual, it's what we normally have, right? So this is why we're going to use it. And why are we then using budgeted overhead cost and also budgeted levels? So the first reason will then be, so if I'm costing my product, and then I come here and then I say, all right, let me then use, so I'm costing my product, and I say, let me then use, so let me just come here, new one, right? So I need to then cost, so I'm using an absorption system, because we don't really do this when we are doing a variable system, because variable system we do what? We get the contribution, so we separate the fixed and the variable. But here, we're then going to then say, if I'm then costing this product, and then I want to cost now then the overheads. If I'm going to use actual overheads, right, to then cost this product. So I cost this product using actual, say actual overheads was the total, let's work on total. So, and then we're going to deal with the rate. Say it was 5,000, right? And then then this was 5,000 actual. But this 5,000 is not normally what will cost a product. So remember, when you're costing a product, say it's a car, you already know how much, because the process is recurring. So you know that, okay, I need this labor, I need this, I use machines of this, maybe I even use electricity of this to cost one car. So you know that. But let's say now, in that period where you're doing the production, there was then an unplanned maintenance, right? Which will then increase our overheads, right? So say normally you will allocate, so you budgeted your overheads to then be 2,000, because normally you will have 2,000 as budgeted, because you know the process, right? It's recurring. But you actually received 5,000, right? And then this 5,000 was increased because of unplanned repairs, for example, or maybe there was then what? So maybe there was an unplanned maintenance as well, right? So that then increased the actual overheads to 5,000. So you see, if we then go to, and I'm going to link this to accounting again. If you go to the prudence definition, we're going to then say the cost of this thing is 5,000 more because of these overheads, and it was supposed to normally to cost 2,000 more. So if we're then making decision of the price to say, okay, our products cost 5,000 instead of the budgeted 2,000 that we know, we're now going to say, okay, our price, we're going to have, so when we sell this product, let's increase 20% margin on the 5,000, and then we get the selling price. But if we then touched or talk to the selling price on this 5,000, you see that we're not giving a clear picture, because there were unplanned things that happened here. And it means next year, it's going to go back to the normal amount or normal capacity. And if it goes back to the normal capacity, now I have to change my price again, because now the cost is lesser. So hence, we then use then the budgeted, because budgeted or normal capacity, it's what we expect to get on a normal situation. So that's the first reason why we use the budgeted. Then the second reason again will then be when the actual happens. And remember, when we are doing this cost, we are doing them to understand our cost and then do pricing as well and make decisions. So when the actual is going to happen at year end, so we're going to know all our actual at year end. So the timing becomes very important. I want to then budget and know my price now so that I can make those decisions. So I can't first wait for year end, then I allocate using the actual overheads, right? So that means that in terms of the timing perspective, I will then prefer, because I want to do my budgeting, I want to do my planning, I will then prefer to then use the budgeted amounts. And then when I use then the budgeted amounts, I can then make those decisions on the pricing. I can then plan rather than waiting for year end to then get the actual figures that are going to then happen, right? So that again is another reason. So come year end, when now what I've budgeted or what I've allocated with what has happened, there's a difference. That's why you're going to then get an over and under recovery. And then that goes to the expense. It does not go to your product, it goes to an expense. It goes to the expense. So I'm gonna go. So let me go on this, and then I can then ask you if you're sorted. So we said we're going to then divide the budgeted overheads with the budgeted level, right, to get our absorption rate, right? So and then I spoke about the limitations of using actual. So we'll then use budgeted, right? Because there are all those issues that I spoke about in terms of then using the actual. So to then address those challenges, we'll then just use budgeted figures to determine the overhead allocation rate. So when we now have then the overhead allocation rate, so your overhead allocation rate, you're going to take your budgeted over your budgeted. Then you have this rate. Then once you then have this rate, you're then going to say, all right, I have now have this actual activity in terms of units, right? So I'm now going to then take my rate, which I then use my budgeted cost and apply it, and then I apply it to the actual activity, right? So now I then I've absorbed the actual activity using the overhead allocation rate. Then once I do that, I'm still sitting again with the actual. And then I have this allocated overheads that I did where I used my overhead allocation rate, which is budget over budget. And then I multiply the actual activity. When I then compare the two, and then I'm like, okay, I have the actual cost are more than what I have done, than what I have allocated, right? Meaning that what did I do? It means that there's more expenses that I've incurred because the actual is more than the allocated overheads. Then the difference between the two goes to the expense. So you don't go and say, I will take that difference of the actual and then I will still include this part of my cost. No, the actual, we leave it. We then agree that we now have an over and under recovery. We take that difference and then it goes to then the expense. So it won't form part of your production cost. Are we still together?
Yes, thank you.
Happiness.
Happiness. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, sure. Any other question? So what again I see a lot of people then using, so they will tell you for example, and they will say the labor, the actual labor was 750, and then they give you the hours, and then they give you the actual rate, right? And then they give you the absorption rate, which is budgeted. When people are costing, or if you are doing ledgers and then you are putting then the costing, people go and take the actual cost of the labor, which that actual cost, if it's an overhead, we don't take the actual cost. We need to get the absorption, the rate multiplied by the actual. That is the one that is going to go to the product, right? The one that we've allocated using our allocation rate, being the overhead allocation rate, and then actual activity, it goes to then the product. Then the difference between that and the actual then goes to an expense. So people then take the whole actual and then they say, okay, the actual, I'm putting it there. That is then my cost of the product. No, when we deal with overhead, we have to get an overhead allocation rate. Then we multiply with the actual activity, and the overhead allocation rate, we use the budget over the budget. Then we get that rate. We multiply with the actual activity. Then we can compare now to say, okay, actual and what we have allocated, the difference go where? It goes to the expense. And the reason why we're doing that, like I said, we want prudence. So we don't want to then overstate the pricing part of things to say, okay, maybe now the overhead cost, they went up, do maybe there was load shedding or something happens. Now I have this actual overhead, which is a lot, and I'm including it in pricing this product. Where else next production, when I do the production next time, I'm gonna go back to the normal amount, which is what I've budgeted. Now the price is just increasing and decreasing because my costs are increasing and decreasing. So we are then we don't want to see ourselves in that position. Hence we do what? Hence we say, let's just use budgeted, because budgeted is what we normally know, because this system and the process we then know how it works. All right. Okay, I'm gonna move now, guys. Any questions? So I'm gonna move and I'm gonna give you guys a break, but let's just start with the introduction of standard costing, and then we're then gonna take a break, and then we're also gonna do a detailed question of material, because I want to touch on material variance, because there I know that's where a lot of you guys have issues, right? Because now that variance is divided into the yield and also divided into the mix. So your labor, I think you can go through that. You'll have a basic knowledge of that, and then your fixed cost as well, variance. You can also go through that. I think you can cope. So what is standard costing, right? And I'm not done. So what is standard costing? So let's start there. So that we know what we are trying to achieve here. So think about it this way. So let's stick to our example, the car example. So if I'm then having a production of a car, so I have this production system, right? I know that my car is going to move from one stage to another stage, and it's going eventually to have this one unit, which is then a car. I know that, okay, I need 4 tires, right, to make, so say I'm making a normal VW. I need 4 tires that are going to be there. I need, labor. So people who are going to be working, I know they're going to spend these hours to make one unit, which is then this car. I know in terms of the kg, maybe let's talk about seats. I know if I want the foam that I then use there, that cotton to make my seats firm, I know that I need, maybe for the whole car, I might need, say, 8 kg of that, right? So I'm just coming up with the numbers here. And then that process is going to then go on and on. So meaning I'm going to then be producing this car, and then I'm done. It's another unit. I'm going to go through the same cycle, producing the next car, and then again, it's another unit. So what does this mean? This means that I then know my standard costing, or my standard cost of producing one unit of a car. So I know my standard costing. I know the price that is involved there, my standard price. I know again my standard amounts of your kgs and hours that you then need to use. So that becomes then your standard costing that you then know, right? And obviously we're talking here if you are operating under normal operations, because sometimes in a production there are things that can happen, and then your price goes up and then down and all those things, but you still have a standard costing. You know that this is then the amount that I then pay for this, right? So although there's some things that can happen, but again, I know that those are as a result of maybe were not effective, or something then happened. So then that becomes then it becomes your standard costing, right? So and this is very much important because it will then help us in terms of just planning and making informed decisions again, because we understand our costing. So we can then compare it with our actual, and then we say, okay, but in our process, we know that this is the cost that we need to make this vehicle, but the actual is like this. So what really happened here in between? And that's where then the concept of variances will then come into play. What happened between our standard costing, because we know to produce 1 unit, it costs this much. But now the actual cost that we then have, it's more than our standard costing. Then we then start understanding, and we do that for what? So that we can control the cost next time, so that we can then know if there's a cost overrun, if we still need to make sure that people are conscious with cost and how they spend and how they buy and how they negotiate, right? And then we then make those decisions. So I'm gonna go again to the Excel, and then we just then try to explain this. So again, we have budgeted cost, right? And then we have your actual cost and actual costs that will then happen. So you'll then budget your labor, and then you budget your material, for example. So let's just touch on material. So let's say you budget your material to make this car. So you can then budget to say, and you are doing this at the beginning, to say, I'm gonna then have, say, 1,000 units of cars that I'm gonna sell, right? And then I have also the price that is there to say, okay, this will then be 750, the cost. So I'm just making up the numbers. Then you go and you sell 1.5 units instead of 1,000 budgeted units. So now if I'm then comparing and doing my variance analysis, I'm then going to then come and say, I'm comparing my budgeted cost with, say, this became 1.250 million, right? So 1.2 million. So if I'm then coming to the budgeted cost and the actual cost, and I'm comparing this, do you see that there's something wrong here? So there's something wrong with me comparing my initial budget that I had with my actual cost, right? So my normal budgeting. And what is then the reason? Then the reason will then be, one, I budgeted this cost saying I'm going to sell 1,000 units, but now I've sold 1.5 units. So if I then compare this and this, and I want to check on my performance, I don't have a clear picture because I then used 1,000 in terms of budgeting. So it does not really talk to each other, because now how then do I determine if for materials, for example, the price that was there or the quantity that I actually used in producing that car, if it was then effective, how then do I deal with that? So you can then see that if I'm making the decision based on just my normal budget and my actual, I don't get the clear picture. So now what does that mean? It means that I then need to do what we call a flexed budget, right? So a flexed budget, what is a flexed budget? So a flexed budget will then be a flexible budget that you will then adjust your normal budget based on actual levels. Because I'm saying that
Sorry, sir.
yes, come through.
Okay, I don't know if I've heard you correctly. You say you are going to do a flex budget if you have the budgeted units, or
Okay. So let's take a step back, right?
Mhm.
So you have your budgeted cost. So at the beginning of the financial year, you're gonna say, all right, I'm budgeting, say,
Mm.
to produce 1,000 units, right? So this
Yes.
will be my actual activity, to produce 1,000
Mhm.
units. Then you go and you produce actual 1.5 units, right?
Yes.
Or say you go and produce less. Okay, so let's just work with the production units for now. Say you go and you
Okay.
produce say 500, half of that,
Okay.
right? So now
Yes.
you have a budget where you said you are producing 1,000 units, but you actually produced 500 units, right?
Okay.
If you are, yeah.
Sorry. Does it come in hand with the, let's say, for example, you produce yes that half, but you didn't produce it for the whole year? I don't know if I'm wrong.
Okay, so say the year it's the same. So the 12 month is the
Okay.
same, right?
Okay.
So let's say
Yes.
the 12 month is the same here, but you then produced less than you actually budgeted, right?
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
if I ask you, what will then be your face value of the performance? What would you say to the performance? Will you say we performed or we didn't perform by just looking at this?
I would just say we didn't perform.
Okay, you will say we didn't perform, right?
Yes.
Okay, say during the year we had so during this year, all of this year, we had a COVID case, and then
Yes.
when we had a COVID case, so let's say it's COVID times, or people are sick, or so something happened there. We had a COVID case, or what we are selling, there was a change in the environment. So there was looting, and then there was a financial crisis, and then there was just a change in demand, right? So there will be a change in demand, and then there was all these things that happened during the year, right? So are
Yes.
you then going to then say to me, it's fair or unfair that I'm now looking at this 1,000 and the actual to then make that judgment to say I didn't perform?
It will be unfair.
It will be unfair, right?
Yes. Yes.
So it means that for us to then see the fairness of it, we need to now flex this budget. We need to adjust this budget to show the actual units of production, so that we can then
Mhm.
compare the adjusted flex budget with the actual. And
Okay.
then
Now.
you understand that now it's going to give me a fair picture, because during the year there were things that I couldn't control. There was maybe a change in demand, a market condition change, or there was
Yes.
production or fluctuating of all these things that I can't control.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And yes, and you can't now come and say, no, but you budgeted to do 1,000, now you did 500, so you didn't do well. So you see, it's not really, it does not really show the true picture if we're then following a budgeted cost and an actual cost.
Okay.
So we then need to flex this. And then now we need to have a flex budget. So once we have a flex budget, I can then say, all right, I have now adjusted this budget. Your adjusted budget, I took everything that happened. Now I can compare my flexed and my actual. So that's the number one thing with standard cost. You never compare the normal budget and the actual budget. And even though the calculation is right, if you then do that, you will lose a lot of marks, because you can't compare the normal budget and there's all these things that we can't control, and then with the actual, you need to compare the flexed budget.
Sorry,
Sure.
may I please ask?
Yes, come
So
through.
the flex budget, it's okay if we get in a scenario that they've given us the budgeted cost, this is actually what the company has planned on the beginning of the year. So
Yes.
what you're trying to say, the flex budget, it's what we call it's what we've planned, but it has been affected by external factors
So
of the environment of the company and or something internally.
yeah, so the flex budget is we are adjusting the initial budget. So
By
we'll have an
actual
initial.
events.
Yeah, come again.
I said by adjusted by actual events you found on the beginning of the year or during the year.
So by actual events or actual levels of activities now.
What led to that?
Okay, so let's and we're gonna do an example here, right, of a flex budget. So let's go back. So we have your normal budget, initial budget, right? So CA Limited budgeted to produce 10,000 units of A. So this initially, you say you're budgeting 10,000 units of product A. So product A requires 2 kg of raw material per unit. And what does it mean? It means that one unit of product A will then have 2 kg of raw materials. So this, you understand, these are your raw materials. And already you know that for me to produce this product, I need 2 kg of raw materials. So that doesn't change, that I know, right? Then each material costs 15 Rand per unit, right? Then during the year, the actual results were a total production of 12,000 units and a total of 23 kgs were utilized. Then the purchase price was then 16 Rand per kg. All right, let's take a step back here and see what happened. So initially, we then say we're gonna produce 10 units. But now at year end, or the actual results, we have now produced 12 units, right? So the material that we need for 1 unit still remains the same, right? So the material for 1 unit that we know still remains the same, but then now the difference is the units that we said we're gonna produce. Now we produce 12. So now if I'm then going to say, use the normal budget. So what are you gonna do with the normal budget? You're then gonna come and say 10,000 units. So for material, for example, so you're gonna say 10,000 units. We multiply by the 2 kg to get the total materials, which are then 20,000. Then you multiply by the cost, right, of material. Then, but the actual was then 12,000 units that happened, right, with the same material. You see that now the units are affecting the way that we are viewing things, because now what if, or what the things that led to the increase in units were things that initially when we budgeted, we didn't have those things. So what we then need to do, we need to flex this budget, and then we flex it based on actual production, so that we can then be able to compare. And maybe before you come through, so what we're going to then do, we'll then going to take the original material, which will then be the 10 multiplied by 2. So it means that initially we'll have then budgeted 20 kgs that we're going to then use. But now we're then going to then flex the material to say that although there is still 2, let's then bring them to the actual units that we then did. So we have the actual units, and then we have what materials that we budgeted initially, but now we have the actual units. Then we have 24. Then I can then say, how many materials did I use in the current year? I used 23,000. And then I can say 23,000 minus the 24,000. I have 1,000. Now I can then talk to that to say what was the issue. But if I then come here and take the 20,000 initially with the 23, I'm getting a difference of 3,000. And it's not fair, because now the 10,000 unit that I will have initially budgeted might have been affected by things that are not within my control to get to the output level. Or maybe we might have hired more people, and then now it increases the output that we then need to do. So now I then need to flex my budget to then show that with the actual production. Then I can compare the actual units with the flexed units. Okay, let's stay on the mic.
Sorry, sir.
Sure.
You
Okay.
lost me. Sorry, who I'm interrupting, because I'm still
Okay.
on the mic.
Okay. Yeah.
Why I am not happy with this example? First, sir, you said budgeted flexed. What makes you to go to flex? It must be caused by events. That is what's in my head. What caused this flexed?
Okay. All right.
Sir, can I help?
So yeah, come through.
Yes, hi Bernice, hi everyone. The way I understand it, for set to be mentioning events and everything. So let me give an example to say that it is day one, you're planning for the year, you're probably producing let's say 5 units of whatever. And then at the beginning of the year, you're telling yourself that under normal circumstances or under normal whatever, I'm going to produce 10 units. This is the units that you've budgeted. And I'm going to actually allocate this much, maybe this much of raw material to this units. This is you at the beginning of the year, right? And then throughout the year, like things like COVID happens, like an example that say, that's an event now. That's from the perspective of the event. The event happens throughout the year. Now you're at the end of the year. So now you wanna check. You want to check how well have you done, or how have you done basically. Now we are at the end of the year. When you started, Bernice made like some sort of a plan or a study to say that, okay, I'm going to be using maybe, let's say, 5 units of raw material, and I'm going to be producing 5 units, whatever products that you're going to come up with. During the year, COVID happens, and when COVID happens, you have at the end of the year. But then at the end of the year, now you produced 3 instead of the 5 that you had planned, right? So now it's not gonna. So what's they saying that it's not gonna be fair for you to say that, okay, my actual production and the actual units that actually happened is probably maybe, let's say, 5, but then I also produced the 3 units, and then as opposed to the 5 raw material that I planned initially and the 5 units that I had planned initially. So what Say is now saying is that because there was an event of COVID that happened throughout the year. So when you planned for 5 products or 5 results based on the 5 raw material that you had, you did not take into consideration all this that is happening now, right? So now for you to be flexing this budget now, the budget that you had planned initially, you are then saying that putting the circumstance of COVID now into place. So I still have this raw material that I'm trying to allocate to my output, right? But then I must cater for this event that happened using what? Using the actual. So I'm still maintaining what I had allocated, and then together with the actual unit to actually compare on the output that was literally generated rather than the one that you've planned before you could know what could happen throughout the year. I don't know if I make sense.
Actually, I understood it that way, right? But now let's get it back to the example, right? Because anything can happen on a test and exam. So what Sir did here, he did not give an event on his example that can cause me to flex, right? And now you're currently on a point in the knowledge whereby I'm saying, if I really want to flex, something must happen, something that I have not planned for. To me, what I realize, what I'm learning is that flexing makes me say, I should readjust my budget based on what's going on right now. That's what I'm understanding. So now what I'm looking and reading an example also myself, I'm saying, what gave Sir the reason
Okay,
to flex?
I hear you now, ne?
Yes.
So and maybe then how I can then come through. So maybe because now you want to link it to an event. So even if there is now a change of demand, right? So let's use a simple example like that. So we initially, when we were budgeting, we then said, okay, our demand and the market that we have, this is how many units we're gonna make based on our demand. So, and then things changed during the year, or we had more demands, hence we then now produced more than we then initially planned to say we're gonna produce, right? In terms of the outputs. So even change in demand, because now the reason that we are then producing more, it is because maybe there was then that change in demand there. So you still have to then flex your budget. So you always have to flex your budget.
Okay, like so, I'm fearing now what I'm doing. I'm cramming, which I don't want.
Okay.
I'm sorry to dwell on this a lot.
Okay.
Can we look at this example?
Sure.
And please tell me, say, okay, Bernice, this is me at the beginning of my year. And
Sure.
this is me saying I am flexing due to this. Is that can we do that?
All right. So let's do this. So we have 10,000 units that you want to produce, or what you budgeted, right? So remember, what is the reason of us doing a variance analysis? So maybe let me ask you, why are we doing a variance analysis?
To me, it's to what I understood is to adjust it based on what's like the actual and the budgeted to know what's happening by the end of the year in simple language. So
Okay. Yes.
so if I say, okay, I am going to sell, this is what I'm going to sell 500 in the year. I'm very happy. I'm so positive. New Year's things. Then now all of a sudden my actual amount is I actually did better than that, or I actually did not do better than that. So now I am comparing these two and put it up to the actual. It actually helps me to know what's going on. I'm actually controlling what's happening.
Okay. So let's go to materials, right? So materials that I used. So when I'm then doing a material variance, what am I saying? I'm saying that I know that to produce this product, I need certain materials, right? So maybe I need 2 kg of materials. Then I will then say at the end, I want to see if I actually then used the 2 kg or I used more. So if I used 3 instead of 2 kg for a unit, I know that the usage was not as what I planned, because in terms of standard, I know I must use 2. Now I use 3. Now that's a problem, right?
Okay.
So we are agreeing there. So I know I'm doing this car. I know that I normally use 2 kg of foam or cotton when I'm doing the seats, or whatever I'm producing, or this product A, I normally use 2 kg of raw material per unit. That's my standard. I know that, right? Then at the end of the year, I then go and then when I check, I see that I used 3 instead of 2. So you see, in terms of material, the usage that I did there, I have to then go back and see what caused this, because I know I normally use 2. It means that I used more materials, which again is a problem. You agree with me?
Yes.
So now stay with me there. Now I then go and produce 10 units. I then budgeted to say I'm producing 10 units. So you go and then you take that 2 kg, which goes to a unit. You multiply it by the 10 units. Now you have what we call 20 kgs of the units, right? Then you go to your actual. You say actual, how many did I use? I used 23 kgs, right? Meaning that 23 kgs of 12 units, if you want to check the price, you can then divide. But I used 23 kgs. So you're going to then go at the end. So let's take out the flex. Let's say the flex is not there. You're going to go at the end and say.
Sorry. So your actual, can you go back to example? Is the utilized. That means that what I actually used physically, it has gone through that process, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes,
But
now I can.
Yes, but then now you see, if I'm then gonna come and then I say I budgeted initially to use 20 kgs. So now we're talking material.
Yes.
So let's talk material. I budgeted to use 20,000 kg materials, but now I'm using 23,000 kg materials. But you see that if I'm then saying I'm getting the reason why, the reason will then be on a lot of factors. The other factor will then be you budgeted 20,000, 10,000, but you actually made 12,000. So that can then be the reason. But then for me to then compare and get a clear picture, I will then say, all right, let me now keep the units the same, so that I can then go and then see in terms of utilizing, because now the units are the same. It's 12,000. And then I know I need to make 2 kg to make this product of 12,000. Now I have 24,000. Now, when I'm doing my analysis, I can then now say, okay, the units are the same. So the units can't be a problem here, right? So what then can be a problem? What is the problem here? So it means that I can then have more details or more information to then say, maybe I use more, less than what I was supposed to use, meaning this then becomes favorable. So now what you're actually doing here is that, and maybe we can move on. I can stay. You can stay on the call after, and then we can discuss it. But what we are trying to do, remember, we are then looking at materials. So if you are then saying I'm gonna look at my material, I'm saying it's 2 kg to make 1 unit. But if I then just choose the 12,000 budgeted, and I say I budgeted to use 20,000 units, and then actual was 23 units, I will then say I used more if I'm comparing my units, because now this is 20,000 that I budgeted, and then the actual was 23. So my conclusion will then be, okay, you budgeted to use 20 kgs. Now you have used 23 kgs. It means that this is unfavorable because it means you used more. But what we're then not saying is that, however, the units are now different. So you can't compare this and this because the units are different. You need to flex your budget to the actual units, so that the units remain as 12,000, 12,000. Then you can compare the usage of the material. Still,
I think I need to. Can I go back to this after what you told me and written down and ask you first thing tomorrow?
yes. Yes,
Correct.
that's fine. But what you then need to know is that we never compare original budget with actual when we are doing standard costing. We need to flex the original budget to then show the same output. Because we want to then say, remember, it's all about control, né? And also checking the materials that we are using. So we want to then say, if I'm then going to then come and say, what is the reason for this performance? I don't want you to then say, no, but we budgeted less units, we did maybe. So I'm going to say, let's keep the units the same. I want to see if in terms of materials usage, what was then the reason there? In terms of the price, what was then the reason there? And I've kept what my actual the same. I've flexed my original budget. I've adjusted it so that it can then be the same. And then now can just compare the kgs to say that, okay, when I've kept the 12,000 the same, we are now having 24,000 and we actually use 23,000, meaning this is a good thing, right? Because I was supposed to use more, but actually we end up using less with the same units.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry?
No, I
Sorry
said that,
to waste your time.
but somebody wants to come in.
Okay, come through.
Yeah, it's still with regards to what Bernice was asking, and sorry to waste other people's time. But then basically, as you're gonna be going through it tonight and asking about it tomorrow, so just think about, because the way I'm getting it, it's like you want to encompass the reason first before you can get the variance. So just at the back of your head, or when you're gonna be studying it, maybe if you try and understand, like, so what Say is trying to say basically is you start by wanting to compare like terms. So compare a flexed budget as well as an actual output or actual results. So get that part first, and the reasons basically comes after on why was this like that, why was that like what. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
All right. Yes, exactly that. I'm hyperlinking. All right. So let's continue. But you guys go and look at this. And if you have issues, we can then touch on it, because this is very much important, especially with standard costing. Because if you then go and compare original budget with this, even though the calculations are right, you won't get the marks. You need to then compare your flexed budget, which is then what you've adjusted. So it's like you're going to the end and say, all right, wait, what we didn't know what will then be our actual when we estimated at the beginning. Then we came with 10,000 at the beginning, but we are at the end. We now know that our output was 12,000 at the end. So then let's revise our budget based on the actual output, because now we know. Then we revise our budget. Then we can compare the revised budget with what we actually used. Then you can then be able to be in a position where you then determine the variances and everything. But let's go and look at this, and then we can then discuss it first thing tomorrow if it still doesn't make sense.
Sorry, sir, maybe I can add a little bit.
Sure.
For me, what helped me, I used to also get confused with it, but what helped me to do the flex part of the budget is I asked myself, what was I supposed to use had I produced the items that I produce now? For example, I would say, if I were to produce 12,000 units, how much would I have used to produce those 12,000 units? Then I'll say, like what you said, 12,000 times 2, then I'll get the 24, and say, what did I actually use? So I say, what was I supposed to use? Had I produced these products that I actually produced? And what did I use? Then I compare those two. That helps a little bit for me.
Yeah,
And
and yeah, 100%, because now you are saying what was I supposed to use here? And I was supposed to use 24 based on my output. So I sold 12,000 cars. What was supposed to be my material with the 12,000? This is what. And then what did I actually use? Then you can then compare the two. And then now you're going to have important information when it comes to the variances to determine what was the cost.
yes.
All right. All right. Time is going to be a big problem. So I'm going to move now. And I'm going to start with material variance, right? So yeah, let me then just come and then I'll do this and then I'll go to the example and then we'll do the example. We'll talk on the example because I'm just then taking the time. So we have then two variances that we'll check the price and then we'll check the quantity. And then it means that if we're then checking the price, we are then saying our standard price that we know is this. And this is the price that happened. So now we want to then check to say, what is then now the difference? Because I know that to make this car, I then have to then spend this on the materials because this is the thing that I do always. I do this process and it's recurring. I do it all the time. So I have a standard price for these materials. Now, if there's a change, is it being caused by then the price that the person went and bought? So now, if I then do that variance, and then I see that there's a difference, I can then say the pricing people or the people who then go and buy, it means that they are not negotiating the right prices. I will then go to them and say, why are you then having a price difference? Because I know these things, the standard cost, it cost this much. So why are you then having a variance with the standard costing? It means that you bought this at an expensive price. It means that you might have changed your the supplies that we normally use, because we know that this is the standard cost, right? Or if you then negotiated less, we'll then say, oh, okay, it means that this is favorable because we know our standard price is then this much, but you then bought this at this much. So now my price, I can then compare the standard and the actual, and then I'm like, oh, okay, it means that you negotiated well. So that becomes favorable. Then when we go to quantity again, it comes back to the example that we did to say, we know that for this cars, we need this quantity of materials. But then now the actual usage that we then used was then more than what we then we know as a standard. So it means that now you didn't then use these materials the way that you were supposed to. Maybe they were cost overruns or you were not being effective. Then I can then talk to you to say in the production level, you used more than what you were supposed to use from the standard. So it means that you are then not being productive and you are then having all these overruns. But if you use less than the standard, I then say, okay, it means that this makes sense, and it's all going to make sense when you do a calculation, right? So we're going to go through a calculation, but that's how you then determine the variances. Then the quantity variances are divided into mix and yield. So think about it this way, right? So if we're talking about mix variance, so I'm saying that if for example in a car I make I made the car seat. So for me to make this cassette, I need the form to then make the cassette. And I need type A material and type B material. So maybe let me just then write this down as well. So in terms of the mix, so we have then the quantity variance. And this quantity variance is split into the mix and then also so it's the mix and the yield, right? So if I'm then talking about the mix, so say I have now this car and I'm saying that I want to do then the seats. And then when I'm then doing the seats, I then say, I then need two types, right? I need type A, which I only need 5 kg of. And then I need type B to make this the mix of the car seats. So I need type B, which I am going to use 10 kg of, right? So I'm going to use 10 kg of this. So this is going to be 10 kg, meaning for me to produce then an output or 1 unit, which is then the output, which is 1 unit. I then need 5 kg of A and 10 kg of B to produce 1 unit, meaning I need 15 kg. So I need some type of A material and I need a type of B material. And then all in all, for me to then produce that 1 unit, I will then need 15 kg, right? So say because this material is expensive, the 5 kg, so it's a bit expensive, more than the 10 kg. And one assumption when we do the mix is that this material can be interchangeable, meaning that I can still use more of A and B and I still get the output, which is then a seat, right? So say this, the type A is a bit expensive. And then I say, all right, let me then go for 4.5 kg of A. And then because it's expensive, and then it then makes the seed to be firm. For me to then cover it, let's say I go for 11 kg of type B and not 10 kg, right? The output is still the same. It's still 1 seed, right? Or 1 unit. But now here I've then used so this will then be 11, this will be 15.5 kg to produce 1 unit. All right, so stay with me here. So this becomes then the normal standard mix that I know, right? So I know that my standard mix will then be, for me to make this 1 seat, will then be me using 5 kg of A, and then me using 10 kg of A, right? Different materials, but the output is then the same of 15 kg. And then if I then say, because 5 is a bit difficult, it's a bit expensive and what, I'm like, no, let me change to 4.5. And then I use 11 here. And then this is 15.5. You understand that by doing this two, I've now changed my mix of me producing 1 cup or one seat or 1 unit. I've now changed my mix because my standard mix is 5 kg of A and 10 kg of B to get 1 unit. But now I've changed my mix. Type A, I have 4.5 kg, and then type B, now I have 11. So I've changed my standard mix from what I then use, I'm used to what I am then having now. So I've changed my mix. However, before, I then used to make 15 kg to make that 1 unit. But me, by changing the mix from 5 to 4.5, and then now I have to use 11, I've now changed the yield as a result, because I used to then have 15 kg to yield 1 input. But now I have 15.5 to yield the same unit, meaning now I've changed my yield from my standard yield, which was 15, to then the new yield, which was 15.5. And then now, in terms of the mix, I've also changed my mix from 5 kg and 10 kg to 4.5 and 11. And I know it might not make sense, so we're going to do an example. But I'm just then trying to then give you a background of what do we mean when we say mix quantity, and what do we mean when we say yield. So again, I get questions to say, what is yield? So think about this. So say you have a cup. So say you have a cup, and then and then you have oranges, right? So when you squeeze these oranges, so 4 oranges will then fill this cup. And then now, so 4 of them will then fill this cup. Then now you go to a different province and you get different types of oranges, but they don't then give you the same results. Now it takes 5 from those ones that you went to then fill this cup. You have now changed your yield, because you then used to use only 4 oranges to then fill this cup. But now, to get the same quantity, you have now changed your yield because now you use the 5, but to still get the same quantity. So that's then the difference between the mix and the yield, but we're still going to do the equation. But that's the theory behind all those formulas to say, if this is my mix, and then I then come and change it, I've changed my mix. And then if as a result of changing my mix, I used to get 15 kg to make one output, I now then use 15.5 kg to still get that one output, then my yield as well have changed. Happiness. I know it's confusing a bit like this, so we're gonna go to the question. But then that's then the theory behind your mix and your yield variances. And if you add this together, you then come and get your quantity. Happiness. We are together, guys. Are together? We're together. Come through. Come here.
Happiness.
Happiness. All right.
I think I'm a bit lost. My mix is what I put in to get the final product, and then the yield is as a result of the input, which will be the output. Or I'm confusing myself even further.
Yeah. Okay. So the mix basically is the mix between the two types of product that we are using, right? So for example here, so this, let's say it's our standard mix. Say for us making this car, we know because we make this car to say we're gonna mix two products, and we always mix 5 kg and 10 kg to then get the 15 kg, which is the outcome. So this is our standard mix, right? Then we hire someone and then they think, no, this 5 kg is expensive. Let me then go and put 4 kg because all of them are interchangeable. So let me go use 4.5. But then for me using 4.5, I might need 11 of B. Then you agree that I've changed now the way I mix type A and type B.
Yes, I agree.
So the mix will then be the mix between type A and type B. So this is my standard mix. I know, remember standard costing is your standard cost that you know. So I know that I mix A and B, but now someone have changed. So my actual mix have changed. So actual results now are that I mixed now 4.5 and then 11. So I've changed my initial mix that I then have. Now I then have this mix. However, by me then changing the mix, the yield will then be what will then I use as a total based in relation to my output. So here I know that my yield, if I use 15, I then yield 1 unit. But now I then see that this has now changed my yield because I now use 15.5 to still have the same unit.
Okay.
Happiness.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. So that's then the difference between this, right? So that's the difference between this. And so these are the formulas. And then I'm also going to then show this keeps on coming back in. So these are then the formulas, and then I'm going to show how you then need to think about them, right? So these are the formulas. So here, so we're gonna then do the formulas, and then we're gonna do this example. So this example will then include all the material variances, and then we'll go through it. So these are then the formula that you then use. But if let's then take a moment first, and then let's just then go back to an easy example, right? So again, we spoke about the flexing. So we spoke about flex budget, and then we then also touched on the actual, right? The actual budget. And then we say now, if then there's a difference between this, so say this is 23 and then this is 26. If there's a difference between this, we then need to know what caused the difference, right? And then we then need to account to the difference to say, okay, what is then the difference? All right, so say we then have, so let's go back to the cinema example that we then had earlier on, right? So when we were discussing, so you have a cinema, and then you sell, say, popcorns. So you sell popcorns, right? And then the same size, so it's the same size of the popcorns that you then sell. So, and then you know that my standard price of these popcorns, same as any other person who's doing production, they will then know their standard price because they do that always and it's recurring. So my standard price, say I need 2 kg for what? for a bucket, right? So I'm just coming up with the figures here. So that so 2 kg, 2.5, 0.25 kg for one bucket. That's the standard price. And then say you sell one, so the standard price of selling, say it's 1.5 for every kg. So this then becomes, so you then need to know the amount of kgs that you then put, and then also the price. So these two are the standard, right? So the standard amount, and then you also have then the standard price that you then need to know. But you then need actual information now, right? So my standard, I know it's my standard. I know that I need 0.25 to put this, and then I need this to put this. Then say then actual, we know that we then have then the 22,000, which was then paid for 800 kgs. And then this means we sold then 3 buckets. So this is our actual information. Meaning when I'm then doing standard costing, I need 2 things. I need to know my standards and I need to know the actual, right? So that's the first thing that I need to perform. So how these formulas are, so if I'm then saying my actual quantity, and then I multiply this with my actual price to then check how much everything was, right? So I know that I sold 800 kg for 2.2, right? Meaning that if I then divide, if I to get my price per kg, so if I say 2.2 divided by 800, I get 2.15 as my price, right? So it means that if I want to get the actual figures, I will then come and say, what is then my price and what is then my actual quantity? So these are the actual figures. I just want to know. So your actual price will then be the 2.575, right? 2.75. And then actual quantity that I sold will then be 800. So this will be given. So in a scenario, you know that these are my actuals. So I can calculate my actual price, and then I can calculate my actual quantity, and then I then get my amounts, right? So the results here, let's say, is then this multiplied by this, which will be 2.2, right? Which I then sold as an actual amount. So actual, no problem. That's good. Then I have now my actual quantity with my standard price. So you see what we are doing here. We are then sort of like then flexing or using the actual quantity. So let me just then do this here and then this here. So my actual price with my actual quantity. So what candidates use, they come here and then they use the budgeted quantity to then calculate this, which again, this you don't use then the actual quantity, use the actual quantity and the standard price. So my standard price is 1.5. So 1.5, and then my actual quantity will then be 800. That is there, right? So my actual quantity 800, my standard price 1.5. Then I then come here 1.5 multiplied by 800, I get 1.2. So if I'm now comparing this and also comparing this, it means that my quantity remains the same here, and these are my actual quantities. Now I can then determine to say that I'm using my actual quantities, and my actual quantity is the standard for everything. Let me now compare my actual price with my standard price to then say, I know that for me to produce 800 kgs, I will then sell a kg by 1.5. But now I see that you sold, or we bought rather, the 1 kg by 2.75, which is our actual. Now I have a problem with you. I've kept my quantity using my actual. so that I can then be able to compare my price only because my actual are here. So then I then see that my standard price for this is 1.5, but now I have then the 2.5. So this then becomes then the price variance that you can then determine, right? To say that I'm putting my actual units constant because that's what I actually got. And then I'm going to then compare my actual price. Then I get my price variance. And then it's then this formula that is here. So the formula will then be my actual volume and then my price and my standard price, because now I'm saying let's use the actual volume because that's what happened, right? Let's not use the budgeted, and then we can then compare the price and the standard price that I normally then know that this is the price that I'm gonna get. Then I have a difference. So now I'm worried to say, all right, you guys who are buying, because now I can't talk about the production. So you guys who are buying here, my standard cost that I know is 1.5, and then you guys have spent 2.75 here. So what is the reason? Because the actual quantity is the same. So you can't then come and say, no, but you can't compare this total because the actual are different. We have kept the actual the same. But then now we are then talking to then the actual price. So you can then see that the cost that I normally would then incur as compared to what I've incurred now, it's more. So this then becomes unfavorable. Happiness. Okay. Happy,
Yes.
right? Sure. Then
So,
if okay,
Manda,
yes.
the reasons, we're gonna get them from their scenario, or we just have to think of general reasons, or what? I don't know.
So the reason that it's unfavorable or favorable.
Yeah, the variance in prices, like why do we have variance?
So yeah. So maybe a question might come that can talk to that, but obviously they'll have to then indicate it in the scenario if they want you to say talk to the difference in the variances, what was the problem. So maybe you can then, it can be a strategic question where you can then use the things that are there. But I wouldn't really worry too much about that. I think what I will worry about will then be, am I favorable or unfavorable? And if it's unfavorable, then something has to direct me to say why that happened in the scenario. So yes.
Oh, okay, in the scenario, because actually the actual price will be given. So
Yes.
obviously you're not gonna say I've determined it
Yes. So
using
maybe
one,
they
two,
can say
three.
what the reason. So maybe the normal reasons will then be, so maybe they can say comment on this, right? So you then can say, okay, this is an unfavorable variance. And this means that, because remember we have different divisions. So we have then the people who are buying, which are then the uh, let's just call them the pricing division, and then we have the people so people who are buying the materials, and then people who are using the material. So let's say the usage divisions. But you then need to know that if we're dealing with the price, the people who are using the materials, we can't talk to them because this variance does not talk to them, because you can see that we are then using then the actual quantity here, or what we then purchase. So we're not dealing with the usage, we're dealing with the pricing, meaning that you then need to know to say the people who are wrong here are the people who are going to buy those materials. So maybe they're not negotiating nice. So obviously there are normal reasons that could be there, but some you can get from the scenario. Maybe they're not
Oh, okay.
negotiating rights. Maybe they changed the supplier. Maybe they did all those things than the supplier that we normally use. But you must know that then it's the people who are buying, not the people who are using that. So that should be standard knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I think also they can say maybe we should evaluate the performance of the purchasing manager, then or the purchasing manager or the buying manager. So you'd use this to see if the manager actually met the standard, and the reasons would be maybe the manager chose an incorrect supplier, or maybe the manager just wanted to buy from a friend or something like that. So I think that those are the reasons that can be given in a scenario.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
100%.
thank
And some
you.
of them you must already know, right? To say what. So even if they don't give you, they're like, okay, what do you think might then be a problem, or why it's the case? So you need to then think about those things. So, okay, maybe the supply is not the normal one. Maybe this, maybe this. So you can also think about those things. So even though they're not there, but they may be the problem as well. All right, I'm gonna move. So bear with me. I'm gonna give you a 5 minutes break. So it's not gonna be very long, guys, because I want us at least to get through this question and then just understand at least material variance. So to get through this, right? So I'm gonna give you a 5 minutes break, just 5. So I'm gonna continue here. Then we have standard quantity, and then also we then have, so let me put it here. So we have our standard price and our standard quantity that we then normally use, right? So the standard price won't change, will then be the 1.5. Now, so this is the selling price or the standard price, which we said this is the standard price. So the standard price, yeah, standard price, and these are the actuals that happened, right? So now with the standard, we are then saying 0.25 kg is then needed to make one bucket. And then we don't then go and say 0.25 multiplied by what we budgeted. We're gonna come and say 0.25 multiplied by the actual buckets that we sold to then get the standard quantity. Meaning I'm gonna come and say 0.2, and then I'm gonna multiply this by the buckets that I sold, and then I'm gonna get 825. But the important thing here is I'm using the bucket that I sold multiplied by this, by the material that I know, to say for one bucket I need 0.25, and then multiply this by the buckets that I actually bought, sorry, the buckets that I actually then purchased here. Then I'm gonna multiply this by then the 0.25, and then I'm gonna get the standard quantity. So in equation, you can then get, when they're doing this, they say the budgeted buckets that we then need will then be 3.2. So it means that I don't expect you guys to then go and say 0.25 multiplied by the 3.2, because now we're not using the actual output that we then did. So it goes back to what we were talking about. So you're going to then take the 0.5 multiplied by the actual buckets. So I'm taking my material, my standard material that I know that for a bucket I need 0.25, but I'm going to use the actual buckets to say that I should then have used 8.25 because I used 0.25 per bucket here. I should have used this based on my standard price, right? So then I multiply this by this. Now the standard price becomes the same. So it means I'm comparing my usage. I'm then saying I used 800 for the 330, or I bought 800 for the 3.3 buckets. And I know my standard is that because I use 0.25 kg standard per bucket and I got 3.3, I should have used 8.825, but I actually used 800, meaning this was then favorable because my budget or my standard cost is to say for the same buckets, I will then use 825, but what I actually happened or I actually used will then be 800. So this then becomes favorable, and this becomes your quantity variance. Happiness. Oh, God, it's late. Happiness.
Yeah, we're good.
Sure.
Yeah, we're good. We're happy.
Yes. So let's not use budgeted, but let's take our material and then sort of like flex them to see that if we then are using this 3.3, how many should we have used? We should have used 825, but now we have used 800. So what does it mean? It means the production department actually did a good job because now they used less than what we normally use. They saved us something here. So they did a good job, meaning maybe they were more effective when they were doing this, or then other reasons that you can then think about. So this then becomes favorable.
Okay, Manda.
Sure.
While you are still here, ne? So are you saying for us to see the what can I say, the proper results, ne? We have to start by checking the price variance and then come to the quantity variance.
So it depends again, right? So it depends what the question asks you. So
Okay.
if the question says determine the price variance, you can determine the price variance only. If it says quantity variance, or everything that has to do with quantity variance, if you can then do this, also is divided into the sales and mix, and we're going to do that. You can then do the quantity variance. However, I'm just showing you to say if I then take my actual and then I then take this, then I get the price. If I then take this and then I take this, then I get the quantity.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe you cannot get to the quantity prior.
No, you can,
Variance, okay.
because you have this, you have this, you have the actual, you have the actual, so you can still
Oh,
calculate your quantity variance.
okay. Thank
Yes.
you.
So these are the formulas. So that becomes this, which is the flexed quantity. So flexing, and it goes back again to the flexing to say if you then, even if your calculations are correct, but you used budgeted here. So you then came and used this 3.2 buckets, which are budgeted, right? And then like, okay, it means that I'm gonna use my budgeted and I compare it to this. We're not gonna give you the marks because now remember you're comparing 3.2 output and this output is this. So we need to make sure that the output remains constant, and then we can then compare materials that we are then putting in. So remember the unit comes with materials. So we wanna look at the materials, the kgs that are there, and then you then can compare. So you then need to flex this by the actual. Okay, I'm passing. All right. Then the mix, like I said, so the mix will then be then what will then be so the mix and the quantity, like I said. So let's go back to our example, right? So the mix will then be, if I'm then saying, so I'm just trying to think of an example that will fit. So let's go back to the type A and type B example. Yeah, let's come back here. So if I'm then saying I'm using 5 kg and 10 kg to then make 15 kg, it means then my mix now will then be, I will then need to get my material mix. So it will mean that I'm then going to then say type A. So say I'm still making the same. I want to say type A, 5, and then 10, which is type B, and then I'm gonna get 15 here. Then if I then say what is then my mix for 1 unit, then I can then get this as a percentage, right? To say that, okay, it means that I get 33% here, and then I get 67% here. And what we're then going to now do with this is that if we then go to the mix here. So if I'm going to take my actual quantity that actually happened, right? And then I'm going to get my actual quantity in proportion to my mix. So what does that mean? So it means that, so this then is my mix, right? So let me say now my actual quantity becomes so I'm then just then thinking, so for type A, say my quantity that I'm having becomes, say 100 kg based on the units, and then this my actual becomes so I'm just coming up with the numbers here. So let's say 300 kg. So this will be my actual that I used. So what you're going to then do, you're going to then get the mix based on this. So I'm gonna go and I know that I then need for my total, I need to have a mix. If my total here is 450, I know that in this 450, I need to have a mix of this standard and a mix again of this as a standard. Then I can compare my actual with my mix that is there. But just keep that thought. We'll do a question and then we'll then address that. And the yield as well. I'm just looking at the time because I really want us to get to this question because it will then give everything into perspective. So I'm gonna give you guys a 5 minutes break, right? So go and then we'll just finish the last 20 minutes. So I'm gonna give you a 5 minutes break. And what I need you to do, so we're gonna extend it by 3 minutes. So 5 minutes, you then come back. The 3 minutes, I want you to then read this question, right? So the required here, it says calculate all the possible material variants. And all the possible material variants are all this. So it's the price, it's the quantity, it's the sales, it's the yield. When a question comes like that, I don't want you guys to then calculate the price and then the quantity, then you leave it like that because these two are easy to then do. But you need to then go to the mix and go to the yield because that's where you're gonna get more marks. And I've seen this when I'm marking to say that candidates will then do price and then do quantity, then they stop there, and then they don't want to do mix and they don't want to do yield. So this is what we're gonna do everything. So 5 minutes break, we come back 20:35. Then from 20:35, 3 minutes, we then just read. So I'm gonna leave this on like this. Then we then read for 3 minutes, and then we then deal with it. So yeah, 20:35, we are back. Right. So let me do this.